My family turned their backs on me, and my fiancée left me all because I chose what they considered worthless. You know how sometimes life hits you with a plot twist so wild that even Netflix would reject it as too unrealistic? Yeah, well, that's basically my story. Sitting here on the deck of my Medea in this quiet Cape Cod bay, watching the sun kiss the horizon while the salty wind tickles my face, I often catch myself thinking about how absolutely bizarre life can be. Here I am, a 41-year-old guy who supposedly had everything, then lost absolutely everything. And now, staring at this endless ocean, I realized something that would have made my old self laugh until he cried. I've never been more free. This is the same ocean that once seemed like a curse when my family turned their backs on me, like I was some wilted rose tossed on the roadside. But let me back up. 3 years ago, I was Caleb Morrison, insurance agent extraordinaire in downtown Boston. My life was so clean, so predictable, I could have printed it on corporate letterhead. Every day, every hour, all mapped out like some corporate wet dream. And I genuinely believed that was success. Or at least, that's what my parents kept telling me. Their family motto might as well have been life as an Excel spreadsheet, where every cell must be filled with profit and flawless reputation. I didn't understand back then that there are things in this world that just don't fit into those neat little cells. Things like dreams, adventure, or God forbid, following your heart instead of your 401k balance. I was their reliable investment, their pride and joy. Or so I thought. You know that feeling when you realize you've been playing a game where everyone else knew the rules except you? That was my entire existence for 38 years. Monday through Friday, I'd squeeze into my Navy suit, the same suit I had 5 copies of because consistency builds trust, and trudge to my corner office. I specialize in marine insurance, which looking back now is hilariously ironic. Here I was, insuring boats for people who actually lived while I sat behind a desk calculating risk factors for adventures I'd never have. My co-workers thought I was living the dream. Corner office on the 15th floor, view of Boston Harbor that cost the company probably $50,000 a year in premium rent. But you know what I did with that $1 million view? I used it to check the weather so I'd know if I needed an umbrella for my 5-minute walk to Starbucks. My routine was so rigid it made military schedules look spontaneous. 6 a.m. alarm, black coffee, no cream, no sugar because successful people don't need comfort foods. 7:30 out the door in my BMW 3 Series. Not too flashy, not too modest, just perfectly unremarkable like everything else in my life. The weekends were just as predictable. Saturday morning golf with clients at the country club, where conversations never strayed beyond handicaps and quarterly projections. Sunday family dinners at my parent house, where Mom would passive-aggressively ask when I was going to settle down properly, and Dad would lecture me about maximizing my earning potential before 40. Speaking of family dynamics, let me tell you about the elephant in our perfectly manicured room, my Uncle Atlas. If our family was a Norman Rockwell painting of American success, Atlas was the guy in the background flipping everyone off. While we were grinding away at the granite of business respectability, Atlas was out there sailing his boat Medea like some living monument to the old maritime law. The wind is your only boss. I only saw him a handful of times growing up, but there's this one memory that stuck with me like a splinter in my brain. I must have been 12, maybe 13. Atlas showed up to some family gathering, probably a funeral because those were the only events that could drag him back to dry land. Everyone else was standing around in their funeral blacks, whispering about stock portfolios and property values, when Atlas starts telling me about this storm he rode out near the Bahamas. His eyes lit up like a kid describing Christmas morning. He's talking about 30-foot waves, lightning splitting the sky, his boat climbing these liquid mountains while he's tied to the wheel, laughing his head off. The way he described it, you'd think he was talking about the best night of his life instead of something that should have killed him. My parents looked at him like he was describing an alien abduction. Mom kept making these little disapproving noises, and Dad eventually pulled me away with some excuse about helping in the kitchen. But I remember thinking, even as a kid, that Atlas seemed more alive in those 5 minutes talking about almost dying than my father did in entire years of success stories. Atlas was my mother's brother, but he'd basically been exiled from the family before I was even born. The official story was that he'd chosen an unstable lifestyle, but reading between the lines, he committed the ultimate family sin. He'd chosen happiness over security. What I didn't know then was that Atlas had been watching our family from a distance all these years. Mom later told me he'd ask about me sometimes, not the others, just me. Maybe he'd sense something in me, that same restless spirit that got me in trouble for skipping school to watch boats in the harbor when I was 16. Maybe he'd heard the whispers of someone like him, stuck, but secretly aching to sail. And maybe that's why he chose me. In our family, even maritime romance was considered an anomaly requiring immediate correction. We were the kind of people who took pride in never taking risks, never coloring outside the lines, never doing anything that couldn't be explained in a quarterly family financial review. So when the lawyer called me 3 years ago with news that Atlas had died and left me something in his will, my first thought was it was probably some debt I'd have to deal with, some legal mess I'd need to clean up to protect the family reputation. The reading of the will was held in this cramped little office in Salem that smelled like old coffee and broken dreams. The lawyer, this ancient guy who looked like he'd personally witnessed the Boston Tea Party, cleared his throat and read the most ridiculous sentence I'd ever heard in my life. To my nephew Caleb, the most imprudent member of this overly prudent family, I leave my vessel Medea and all her secrets in hopes that he might finally learn what it means to live instead of merely exist. At first I laughed, not a happy laugh. More like the sound you make when reality breaks and you can't process what just happened. Me, the guy who needed GPS to find his way out of a parking garage, the man whose idea of adventure was trying a different flavor of protein bar. Then I saw the attached photos and my laughter died in my throat. This wasn't some cute little sailboat for weekend lake trips. This was a 60-foot piece of maritime history that looked like it had fought in World War II and somehow survived with dignity intact. The lawyer handed me a set of keys and some papers, including coordinates for where she was moored in Bermuda. Bermuda? I'd never been further from Boston than a business conference in Hartford, and now I owned a boat in Bermuda. My first reaction shifted from laughter to pure panic. What the heck was I supposed to do with a boat? I could barely work my office coffee machine without calling IT support. Now I was supposed to be some kind of sea captain? But then the family weighed in, and their reaction made my panic look like Zen meditation. Within hours of the will reading, my phone was buzzing like an angry beehive. My parents, aunts, uncles, the whole Morrison family council had assembled for what they called an emergency financial intervention. It felt more like a tribunal, where I was both the defendant and the evidence. Dad led the charge with his usual blend of disappointment and financial projections. Caleb, this is exactly the kind of irresponsible nonsense we'd expect from Atlas. Do you have any idea what the maintenance costs are on a vessel that size? The insurance premiums? The marina fees? Mom took the emotional approach, which in our family meant wielding guilt like a surgical instrument. We raised you better than this, sweetie. This boat is just Atlas trying to drag you down with him, even from beyond the grave. It's like he's trying to infect you with his wanderlust disease. My Aunt Margaret, who'd never met a tax write-off she didn't analyze to death, had already done the math. The smart move is obvious, Caleb. Sell it immediately, take the money, and put it towards something sensible. A bigger house, maybe, or better yet, another investment property. Uncle Robert, the family's self-appointed voice of reason, delivered what he probably thought was the kill shot. Think about your career, son. You can't maintain professional credibility while gallivanting around on some floating midlife crisis. What will your clients think? For 3 weeks, they tag-teamed me with phone calls, surprise visits, and carefully orchestrated family interventions disguised as casual dinners. Every conversation somehow circled back to the same theme. Sell the boat, forget Atlas ever existed, and get back to being the reliable, predictable Caleb they could count on. But the more they pushed, the more something inside me started pushing back. It wasn't rebellion exactly. I was too old and too tired for teenage angst. It was more like a voice I'd never heard before, asking questions I'd never thought to ask. Why was everyone so terrified of a boat? Why did the idea of adventure make them look at me like I contracted something contagious? And why did their definition of success feel so much like a beautifully decorated prison cell? Then came the ultimatum that changed everything. Abby and I had been together for 2 years. She was perfect on paper. MBA from Wharton, marketing director at a Fortune 500 company. The kind of woman who looked great at company Christmas parties and knew exactly which fork to use at business dinners. She fit into my life like a designer accessory, which I now realize should have been my first red flag. The conversation happened in my apartment, the same beige monument to upper-middle-class success that I've been so proud of. Abby sat across from me at my dining table, the one a salesman once said, projectus ability and sound decision-making. She clearly rehearsed what she was going to say. Her tone was measured, reasonable, the same voice she probably used to shut down bad marketing proposals. Caleb, I've been patient about this boat situation, but we need to be realistic. I'm not going to build a future with someone who makes decisions based on some dead uncle's romantic fantasies about the sea. Her words were like ice cubes dropping into my stomach, one by one. She kept talking, laying out her perfectly logical arguments about financial responsibility and social expectations and career trajectories. But all I could hear was that phrase echoing in my head, some dead uncle's romantic fantasies. That's when it hit me. This wasn't really about the boat. This was about whether I was the kind of person who could look at a gift of possibility and see adventure, or whether I was the kind of person who could only see problems in spreadsheets and other people's expectations. It's really quite simple, Abby concluded, and I could tell she thought she was being generous by giving me a choice. Either the boat goes or we do. I won't compete with some floating symbol of irresponsibility. I sat there for a long moment, looking at this woman I thought I loved, in this apartment I thought I wanted, surrounded by all the trappings of the life I thought I was supposed to live. And for the first time in 38 years, I asked myself what I actually wanted. The answer surprised me more than anyone. Then I guess we're done, I heard myself saying. The words came out so calmly that even I was shocked. It was like watching someone else take control of my life, someone who'd been locked away for decades and finally found the key. Abby's perfectly composed mask slipped for just a second. She'd expected me to fold, to choose security over uncertainty, to be the predictable Caleb who always made the safe choice. Her surprise quickly turned to anger, then to something that looked almost like disgust. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life," she said, gathering her purse and her dignity. "Don't come crying to me when you're broke and alone on that ridiculous boat." After she left, I called my parents to tell them about my decision. The conversation lasted exactly 90 seconds before Dad hung up on me. Mom called back an hour later, crying, asking me how I could throw away everything we'd worked for. Within a week, the family communication stopped entirely. No more Sunday dinners, no more holiday invitations, no more casual check-ins about my career prospects. It was like I'd been erased from their personal Excel spreadsheet, filed away under bad investments, and forgotten. My colleagues were more subtle but equally devastating. Word travels fast in the insurance world, and apparently choosing a boat over financial stability is the kind of story that makes people very uncomfortable. Clients started requesting other agents. My boss began having concerns about my focus and commitment. The final insult came when they offered me a voluntary resignation package. Officially, it was about declining performance metrics and decreased client engagement. Unofficially, everyone knew I'd been distracted, taking calls from lawyers, researching boat mechanics during lunch breaks. Hard to sell insurance when your mind's already sailing. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, surrounded by furniture that suddenly looked like props from someone else's life. No job, no plan, no girlfriend, just me and the so-called inheritance everyone said was more cursed than gift. And yet, for the first time in my life, I wasn't panicking. I was curious. I realized that everything I thought was mine had always been conditional. Conditional on me being who they wanted me to be, doing what they expected me to do, never asking questions that made them uncomfortable. The moment I stepped outside those lines, it all evaporated like morning fog. Standing there in that empty apartment, I felt something I hadn't felt since I was a kid. What was this boat Atlas had left me? Why had he chosen me, the most landlocked member of our family? And what had he meant by all her secrets? These weren't the kind of questions that showed up on insurance forms or business plans, but they were the first real questions I'd asked myself in decades. I spent that whole night staring at the ceiling, thinking about Atlas and that story about riding out the storm, about the way his eyes had lit up when he talked about dancing with death on the open ocean. Maybe he'd known something the rest of us had forgotten. Maybe the point wasn't to avoid the storm, but to learn how to sail through it. The next morning, I booked a flight to Bermuda. As the plane lifted off from Logan Airport, I pressed my face to the window and watched Boston shrink below me. Somewhere down there was my old office, my old apartment, my old life. From 30,000 feet, it all looked very small and very far away. I realized that everything that had been mine now remained somewhere back there on dry land. Up here, above the clouds, I was just a man with a plane ticket and a set of boat keys, flying towards something I couldn't even begin to imagine. The thought should have terrified me. Instead, it made me smile for the first time in weeks. I was about to meet my inheritance, this mysterious Medea that had cost me everything I thought I valued. And something told me that what I'd find hidden in the heart of that ship would change my life forever. That is, assuming I could figure out which end was the front before I got myself tangled up in the ropes pretending I was Captain Courageous. But hey, what's the worst that could happen? I'd already lost everything else. At least this story would be mine. And that was more than I could ever say about the life I left behind. I arrived in Bermuda holding a set of boat keys like a kid holding a magic sword. Only I had no idea which end to swing. The coordinates Atlas had scrawled on that old map led me to Royal Naval Dockyard, where boats worth more than small countries bob alongside rusty fishing vessels that looked like they'd seen better decades. I'll be honest, even after seeing those photos in the lawyer's office, nothing prepared me for the reality of Medea in person. Pictures don't capture the sheer presence of 60 feet of weathered history. What I found made my insurance-trained brain immediately start calculating liability premiums. Medea wasn't just a boat. She was pure, weathered nostalgia from the 1930s, looking like she'd stared down 3 hurricanes and still held a grudge. Picture this. A guy who'd spent his entire adult life in climate-controlled environments, whose biggest navigation challenge was finding the bathroom at Fenway Park, now standing before this maritime dinosaur that clearly had stories to tell. Stories that probably involved storms, adventure, and the kind of danger that made my old job look like a knitting circle. My first attempt to board her was like watching a penguin try to pole vault. I missed the deck entirely and nearly took a swim in Hamilton Harbor. Real smooth, Caleb. The dockmaster, this weathered Bermudan guy who'd probably seen every type of boat owner imaginable, just shook his head and muttered something about landlubbers and their inheritance problems. But here's the thing about Medea. Underneath all that rust and neglect, she had something that my BMW and corner office never possessed. Soul, character, the kind of presence that made you understand why sailors talk to their boats like they're alive. She wasn't just transportation. She was a companion with a past. Those first few weeks living aboard were like starring in my own personal reality show called How to Survive When You Have No Survival Skills. I went from a guy who complained when the office air conditioning was 2 degrees off to someone who had to figure out how to make coffee when your kitchen was tilting 15 degrees and everything not tied down was trying to migrate to floor. The learning curve was steeper than a Vermont ski slope. The marine toilet alone almost made me abandon ship. I spent an entire afternoon trying to figure out why the water pump sounded like a dying walrus, only to discover I'd been turning the wrong valve for 3 hours. I could almost hear Atlas chuckling from the great beyond, watching me stumble around his perfectly organized floating home. But slowly, something beautiful started happening. My body began adapting to the rhythm of the waves. My ears learned to distinguish between the normal creaks of an old boat settling and the sounds that meant, hey, dummy, something's actually wrong. I discovered muscles I didn't know I had, and my hands, those soft, insurance adjuster hands that had never held anything heavier than a stapler, started developing calluses. The real revelation came one morning when I woke up before dawn and realized I wasn't hearing random noises anymore. I was starting to understand her language. The gentle bump against the dock wasn't annoying. It was her saying good morning. The way she swayed wasn't instability. It was a conversation between Medea and the sea, and I was learning to listen. That's when I understood what Atlas had been trying to tell our family all those years. This wasn't about boats or sailing or some midlife crisis. This was about remembering what it felt like to be alive instead of just existing. Out here, PowerPoint presentations seemed about as relevant as snow boots in Miami. What mattered was whether you could tie a proper knot, whether you could read the sky for weather, whether you could trust yourself when everything you thought you knew got stripped away. As John Shedd once said, a ship in harbor is safe, but that is not what ships are built for. I was beginning to understand that my harbor had been that corner office, and I was the ship that had never left port. Atlas had given me more than a boat. He'd given me permission to finally set sail. It was during my third week aboard, while I was trying to fix a loose board in what I'd learned was called a main cabin, that everything changed. I was working on Atlas's old navigation table, this beautiful piece of mahogany that had probably seen more of the world than most people ever would. The drawer was sticking, and I was getting frustrated trying to pry it open when my hand brushed against something odd underneath. There was this weird bump, like a hidden latch or button. My heart started racing, not from exertion, but from that electric feeling you get when you know you're about to discover something significant. It reminded me of being a kid and finding a secret compartment in an old desk, except this time the stakes felt infinitely higher. I fumbled around under the table for what felt like an hour, my fingers exploring every inch it would grain until I found it, a small, cleverly concealed panel that opened with the gentlest pressure. Inside was a space just big enough for a book, and inside that space was exactly what you'd hope to find in a hidden compartment on a mysterious boat. Atlas's personal journal. The journal was bound in leather, so worn it felt like silk, with pages that had clearly been handled by someone who treasured what was written inside. When I opened it, I could almost hear Atlas's voice in the carefully crafted sentences that filled each page. His handwriting was as free-spirited as he'd been, flowing across the pages like water finding its own course. The first entry I read made me sit down hard. Life isn't about how much you accumulate, Atlas had written. It's about what you discover along the way. Most people spend their whole lives collecting things, money, status, approval, when what they really need is to collect experiences, stories, moments that make them feel truly alive. I felt like I was reading my own obituary, except Atlas was describing a life I'd almost lived instead of the one I'd actually been sleepwalking through. Every page was a revelation, a window into a philosophy of living that our family had rejected as impractical, but which now seemed like the only practical way to actually enjoy being human. But then I reached the entries that made my blood pressure spike and my hands shake. Atlas wasn't just some philosophical wanderer sailing around having deep thoughts about existence. He was a treasure hunter. An actual, honest-to-goodness treasure hunter who'd spent decades tracking down shipwrecks and lost maritime treasures. And he was good at it. The journal was filled with meticulous records of his expeditions, detailed maps of dive sites, photographs of artifacts he'd recovered, and research notes that read like something out of a history textbook. This guy had found Spanish coins off the coast of North Carolina, recovered pewter plates from British merchant vessels near Nova Scotia, and apparently made enough money from his discoveries to fund his adventures and maintain Medea. But here's what blew my mind. He wasn't doing it for money. Every entry made it clear that the treasure was just a means to an end. Gold is simply the passport that lets you see the world and unlock its secrets, he'd written. The real treasure is the journey itself. The people you meet, the stories you collect, the person you become when you stop being afraid of uncertainty. I could practically hear him laughing at our family's obsession with financial security when he'd been out there living like a character from the adventure novels I'd loved as a kid but never had the courage to emulate. Atlas had figured out how to make adventure pay for itself, and he'd been doing it for decades while we sat in boardrooms arguing about quarterly projections. Then I found the entry that changed everything. It was dated just 6 months before his death, and it was about a Spanish galleon called Nuestra Señora de la Candelaria. The ship had gone down in 1709 somewhere in the Florida Everglades, carrying what Atlas described as a cargo valuable enough to fund adventures for several lifetimes. Atlas had found a wreck site years earlier, but had only managed to recover a few pottery fragments and some small silver coins before weather forced him to abandon the expedition. But his note suggested he'd barely scratched the surface. The real treasure is buried deep in the mud, he'd written, like a secret waiting for the right person at the right time. The entry included detailed sketches of the seafloor, GPS coordinates, tide charts, and even recommendations for diving equipment. It was like finding a treasure map drawn by someone who actually knew where the treasure was buried. This wasn't some romanticized fantasy. This was legitimate archaeological research backed up by historical documents and first-hand exploration. At the bottom of the entry, Atlas had written something that felt like a direct message to whoever found his journal. "Nephew, you didn't think I'd leave you just an old boat, did you? That would be boring. And boredom is the only real enemy in life." I sat there on Medea's deck, holding this journal that represented everything my family had taught me to avoid: risk, uncertainty, adventure, the possibility of failure. But for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't thinking about the downside. I was thinking about the possibility that maybe, just maybe, I could be the kind of person who followed treasure maps instead of insurance protocols. My first instinct was to dismiss it as a fantasy of an old sea dog who'd spent too much time alone with his imagination. After all, I was a facts and figures guy, not some dreamer chasing fairy tales across the Caribbean. But then I looked around at my current situation: unemployed, relationship-less, family-less, living on a boat I barely knew how to operate, and realized I didn't exactly have a lot of safe, conventional options left. What did I have to lose? My stable career? Gone. My predictable relationship? History? My family's approval? They'd already written me off as a lost cause. The only thing I had left was this boat and whatever courage I could scrape together to start living instead of just surviving. I spent the next 3 days reading and rereading every page of Atlas's journal, cross-referencing his notes with maritime databases online, researching the history of Nuestra Senora de la Candelaria. Everything checked out. The ship was real. The wreck site was documented but unexplored, and Atlas's research was thorough enough to convince even my skeptical insurance adjuster brain that this wasn't some elaborate fantasy. The more I learned, the more I realized Atlas had left me something far more valuable than a boat. He'd left me a roadmap to becoming the person I'd always been too scared to be. Someone who took risks, who trusted their instincts, who understood that the biggest risk in life isn't failing at adventure. It's succeeding at mediocrity. That night, I sat on Medea's deck, watching the stars reflect on the harbor water, feeling something I hadn't experienced since I was a kid, dreaming about pirates and buried treasure. Hope, excitement, the electric anticipation of possibility. Atlas's journal wasn't just a record of his adventures. It was an invitation to mine. I stood at a crossroads I couldn't have imagined 3 months earlier. I could play it safe, sell the boat, take whatever money I could get, and try to rebuild some version of my old life. Or I could take the biggest leap of faith in my admittedly cautious existence and see if a former insurance adjuster could transform into a real-life treasure hunter. What the heck? I said out loud to the stars and the waves and whatever spirit of Atlas might have been listening. If I'm going to fail, I might as well fail at something interesting. At least then I'll have a story worth telling instead of just existing. That was the moment Caleb Morrison, insurance agent, officially died. What was about to be born wasn't just a sailor. It was someone finally brave enough to live. The journey was just beginning, and I could already feel the salt air working its way into my bones. And you know what? It tasted a whole lot better than corporate coffee. So there I was, sitting on my inherited boat with a treasure map that might as well have been written in hieroglyphics, facing a small problem. My money was running out fast. Between marina fees that seemed designed to bankrupt anyone without a trust fund, emergency repairs that Medea desperately needed after sitting neglected for months, and the basic cost of living on a boat, my savings were disappearing faster than my old corporate benefits package. Well, not completely broke, but close enough that my daily budget consisted of ramen noodles and whatever fish I could catch off the stern. Atlas's journal was fascinating, but fascinating doesn't pay for diesel fuel or diving equipment. That's when I discovered something Atlas had hidden in plain sight. Medea wasn't just a boat. She was like a floating antique store that nobody had bothered to inventory. bronze telescopes from the 1920s, a Longines chronometer that still kept perfect time, brass sextants that probably navigated more oceans than most modern GPS units. Every drawer I opened revealed another piece of maritime history that Atlas had collected over decades of adventure. I never thought I'd become an antique dealer, but desperate times call for creative solutions. Picture this. A former insurance adjuster learning how to photograph vintage nautical instruments for eBay listings, trying to write descriptions that made rusty old compasses sound like priceless artifacts. Which, to be honest, some of them were. The process was both hilarious and humbling. I'd sit there with my laptop, surrounded by brass and bronze, trying to figure out what the heck a binnacle compass was worth while seagulls mocked me from the rigging. Google became my best friend as I researched everything from ship's bells to barometers, learning more about maritime history in 3 weeks than I'd absorbed in my entire previous life. The negotiations with antique dealers were like learning a completely different language. These guys could spot an amateur from a nautical mile away, and they weren't shy about trying to lowball me. But my insurance background had taught me something valuable about reading people and assessing value. Plus, I had something they wanted, authentic pieces with provenance, not reproductions from some factory in China. The breakthrough came when I found Atlas's documentation. He kept meticulous records of everything, complete with photographs and historical research. That Longines chronometer? It had belonged to a merchant captain who'd survived the Titanic disaster. Suddenly, I wasn't just selling old boat stuff. I was selling pieces of actual history. After 6 weeks of wheeling and dealing, I'd managed to scrape together $32,000. Not exactly retirement money, but for a guy whose day job was already ancient history, it felt like a windfall. More importantly, it was enough to fund what might be the most ridiculous career change in modern history, from insurance adjuster to treasure hunter. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, conducting these small-scale pirate operations that felt more honest than half the supposedly legitimate deals I'd processed in my corporate days. At least when I was haggling over a brass telescope, both parties knew exactly what we were trading. No fine print, no hidden clauses, just straightforward commerce between people who appreciated old things with stories. With cash in hand, I faced my next challenge, learning how to actually treasure hunt. This meant 2 things: figuring out how to dive like something other than a panicked tourist, and learning to operate media like an actual sea captain instead of someone who'd accidentally wandered onto the wrong boat. The diving lessons were humbling in ways that corporate life had never prepared me for. I signed up with an instructor in Hamilton who took one look at my pale, office worker physique and probably started calculating how many lessons it would take to turn me into something that wouldn't immediately die underwater. My first time breathing through a regulator felt like trying to suck air through a cocktail straw while someone held my head in a fish tank. The instructor, a weathered Bermudian named Marcus, who'd probably taught diving to tourists since the Reagan administration, watched me flail around the shallow end of the marina with the patient expression of someone who'd seen every possible way to panic underwater. "Relax, Mon," Marcus would say in that lilting Caribbean accent. The ocean, she don't respect fear, but she do respect preparation. Easy for him to say. He moved underwater like he'd been born with gills. I moved like a sea cow having an anxiety attack. But gradually, something clicked. The underwater world stopped feeling like an alien environment and started feeling like, well, still an alien environment, but one where I might actually survive long enough to find something interesting. I learned to trust my equipment, to move efficiently, to read the subtle signs that meant my air was running low or my buoyancy was off. Learning to captain media was a different kind of education entirely. Atlas had left detailed logs and maintenance records, but reading about engine repair and actually fixing a cantankerous diesel motor that had been chugging along since the Carter administration were 2 very different things. I spent more time arguing with that engine than I'd ever spent in corporate meetings, and the engine was significantly less cooperative than most of my old colleagues. GPS navigation should have been simple for someone who'd lived his entire life in the digital age, but apparently there's a difference between finding the nearest Starbucks and plotting a course through shifting currents and changing weather. I signed up for a Coast Guard auxiliary boating safety course and spent 3 weeks learning everything from right-of-way rules to emergency procedures. Getting my boat operator's license felt like cramming for finals all over again, except this time the consequences of failing weren't just bad grades. They were potentially fatal mistakes on open water. I had to learn to read charts, understand tides, and interpret weather patterns, skills that made Excel spreadsheets look like children's games. The real breakthrough came when I stopped fighting the boat and started working with her. Medea had her own personality, her own quirks and preferences. The engine ran smoother when you warmed it up gradually. The steering responded better with gentle pressure than forced commands. It was like learning to dance with a partner who'd been waiting decades for someone to understand her rhythm. By late spring, I felt ready to attempt a journey to Florida. Not confident, exactly, but ready in a way that someone who's exhausted all their alternatives can be ready. I had basic diving skills, marginal boat handling abilities, $32,000, and a treasure map drawn by a dead uncle. What could possibly go wrong? The journey south along the Atlantic coast was simultaneously terrifying and magical. Every day brought new challenges, equipment failures, weather delays, moments where I questioned whether I completely lost my mind. But it also brought something I had never experienced in my climate-controlled corporate existence, the raw satisfaction of handling problems with my own hands and brain instead of delegating them to specialists. Charleston, South Carolina changed everything. I'd pulled into the harbor for supplies and repairs, planning to stay a day or two before continuing to Florida. Instead, I found Anna. She was working on a painting at the end of one of the docks, capturing the late afternoon light on the harbor with the kind of focused intensity that made the world around her disappear. I probably stood there watching her work for 10 minutes before she noticed me. This woman in paint-splattered overalls who moved her brush like she was conducting a symphony. When she finally looked up, she had these eyes that seemed to see everything, not just what was in front of her, but what could be. We got to talking over coffee at a waterfront cafe, and I found myself doing something I hadn't done since leaving Boston. Having an actual conversation with someone who didn't immediately judge my life choices. "So, what's your story?" she asked, and somehow I ended up telling her the whole ridiculous tale. The corporate job, the family meltdown, the inheritance that everyone thought was a curse. I used to be office plankton, I said, swimming in circles in a corporate fish tank. Now I'm not sure what I am. "Where you headed next?" she asked, genuinely curious. I laughed, partly from embarrassment, partly from the absurdity of it all. You're going to think I'm completely nuts, but treasure hunting. Instead of the usual concerned look I'd gotten used to, Anna's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Are you serious? That's amazing. I've always dreamed about real adventures like that. I've been saving up for years, hoping to buy a little sailboat someday and just disappear for a while, see what's out there." She told me she lived nearby in a cramped rental apartment, working as a freelance illustrator, basically living paycheck to paycheck but dreaming of escape. We talked for hours about travel, adventure, the kind of life most people only read about in books. "You know," I said, probably emboldened by too much coffee and her infectious enthusiasm, "there's plenty of room on Medea if you ever want to try the adventure thing for real." Anna laughed, but I could see something flickering in her eyes. "Oh, right. Just drop everything and sail off into the sunset with a stranger? I have a job, responsibilities, a lease." The next morning, I woke up to someone calling my name from the dock. I stumbled out of the cabin, still half asleep, and there was Anna standing on the pier with a backpack and 2 duffel bags, grinning like she just won the lottery. "So," she said, "about that adventure you mentioned. Turns out my lease was month to month. My landlord was a jerk anyway, and I just remembered that life's too short to spend it painting other people's dreams instead of living my own." Anna brought something to the expedition that I hadn't even realized was missing. Perspective. She was an artist, but she was also a history buff with an academic background in maritime archaeology. While I've been focused on the mechanics of treasure hunting, she understood the stories. She could look at Atlas's sketches and see not just coordinates, but narratives about real people who'd lived and died on that galleon 3 centuries ago. More importantly, she believed in the quest not because she wanted the treasure, but because she understood that some journeys are worth taking regardless of what you find at the end. She saw it not as madness, but as the kind of story history books regret missing. We spent 2 weeks in Charleston's libraries and archives, cross-referencing Atlas's research with historical records. Anna had connections in the academic world, and she used them to verify details about Nuestra Senora de la Candelaria that I never could have accessed on my own. The ship was real, the cargo manifest was documented, and the approximate location of the wreck matched Atlas's calculations almost perfectly. What made our research even more convincing was what we found in the NOAA database. The wreck site was listed as a known archaeological location, but with no recorded recovery of significant artifacts. That meant either Atlas was wrong about the treasure, or nobody else had been smart enough, lucky enough, or persistent enough to find what he discovered. Knowledge is treasure, too, Anna said one evening as we pored over copies of 18th century shipping records. And it's more valuable than gold because nobody can take it away from you. She had this philosophy that every discovery, whether it was a lost ship or a new way of seeing light on water, added something permanent to who you were as a person. By the time we left Charleston, we weren't just expedition partners. We were a team. Anna brought her artistic eye, her research skills, and most importantly, her absolute conviction that we were doing something worth doing. I brought my newly acquired boat handling skills, my treasure map, and a lifetime of corporate risk assessment that helped me plan for the thousands of things that could go wrong. The Florida Everglades welcomed us like ancient guardians who've been waiting centuries to test our resolve. This wasn't a Florida of beach resorts and theme parks. This was a Florida that predated air conditioning and highway systems, where water and land blended together in ways that made navigation as much art as science. Every day was a calculated risk. Shallow waters that could ground Medea if we miscalculated the tide. Currents that could push us miles off course before we realized what was happening. Weather that could shift from calm to dangerous faster than you could say, hurricane season. And yes, the occasional wildlife reminder that humans were definitely not at the top of the food chain in this particular ecosystem. The diving conditions were unlike anything I'd trained for in Bermuda's clear blue water. The Everglades served up visibility measured in feet rather than yards, water that changed color and clarity with every tide, and a bottom composition that seemed designed to hide secrets. Every dive felt like archaeology and detective work combined, carefully probing through centuries of accumulated sediment, looking for shapes that didn't belong to nature. Week after week, we found tantalizing hints, but nothing definitive. Pottery fragments that could have come from anywhere, metal pieces so corroded they were unidentifiable. The kind of debris that made you think you were close to something significant while providing absolutely no proof that significant something existed. My faith started wavering around the 6-week mark. The money was running low. The weather was getting more unpredictable, and I was beginning to wonder if Atlas had been a brilliant treasure hunter or an old man with an overactive imagination. Maybe Uncle Atlas just made the whole thing up. I muttered to Anna one evening after another fruitless day of diving. Anna looked at me with that expression she got when she was about to say something that would either inspire me or make me question my sanity. "Caleb," she said, "Atlas knew what he was doing. He left you this treasure not just as gold, but as an adventure. You've already found something more valuable than coins, the knowledge that you can move forward even when everything seems impossible and not break under pressure. This isn't about money. This is about the journey." Her words hit me like a revelation. I'd been so focused on validating Atlas's treasure map that I'd forgotten the real treasure was the person I was becoming through the search. The insurance adjuster who'd been afraid to make decisions without approval committees had become someone who could navigate unmarked waters, solve mechanical problems with improvised tools, and risk everything on the possibility of discovery. That realization came just in time, because 3 days later, everything changed. It was late afternoon. The light was starting to fade, and we'd agreed this would be the last dive of the day. I was working a grid pattern about 20 feet down, using a metal detector and my hands to probe through the soft-bottom sediment. I'd already found a usual collection of modern trash, beer cans, fishing weights, pieces of aluminum that could have come from anything built in the last 50 years. Then my hand hit something different. Not metal, not modern debris, but wood, old wood, with a distinctive texture of timber that had been underwater for centuries. My heart started pounding. So hard I was sure Anna could hear it through her own regulator 30 feet away. I began carefully clearing away sediment, working with the patience Atlas had taught me through his journal notes. This wasn't about speed. This was about archaeology. Every handful of mud I moved might be covering something that hadn't seen light since the 18th century. The wood turned out to be part of a chest. Not huge, maybe 2 feet by 3 feet, but definitely constructed with the kind of craftsmanship that suggested it had contained something valuable. The metal reinforcements were corroded beyond recognition, but the basic structure was intact. I was just starting to figure out how to safely extract it when the weather made the decision for me. The sky, which had been typically tropical blue just minutes before, suddenly turned the color of old pewter. The wind picked up from nothing to serious in what felt like seconds, and the water around me started moving in ways that suggested Medea was about to have a very rough time staying in one place. Emergency ascent procedures went out the window. I had maybe 10 minutes before the storm hit full force. Enough for one decision, not two. Atlas had never lied in that journal. Every note had checked out, and if he believed this chest was worth risking everything, maybe it was. I chose risk. Getting that chest to the surface while the weather tried to kill me was like dragging fate out of the mud, while the sky tried to drown me. Every wave that hit Medea sent vibrations down the anchor line that threatened to knock me off course. My air was running low. My buoyancy was completely shot from the weight of the chest, and I was pretty sure Anna was having her own crisis trying to keep our boat from being driven onto the nearest sandbar. But somehow, miraculously, we got aboard. Dripping, exhausted, battered by wind and rain, we stood on Medea's deck staring at a waterlogged wooden box that might contain absolutely nothing or might justify every crazy decision I'd made since leaving Boston. The chest sat between us like a question we'd spent our lives avoiding, and now had no choice but to answer. I could feel that we were standing at the edge of something that would change everything, not just our bank accounts, but our understanding of what was possible when you stopped playing it safe and started living like the stories you'd always been afraid to write yourself. But opening it would have to wait. First, we had to survive the storm that was doing its best to remind us that the ocean doesn't care about human ambitions. As the rain hammered down and Medea rode out the weather like the tough old sailor she was, I realized this was only the beginning. Finding the treasure was just the first challenge. What came next would test everything I'd learned about navigating treacherous waters. And most of those waters wouldn't be made of salt and sea, but of contracts, lawyers, and the kind of sharks you don't find on sonar. The storm passed, leaving behind that crystalline clarity that only comes after nature has finished reminding you who's really in charge. Anna and I sat on Medea's deck, staring at the chest like it might explode if we looked at it wrong. The moment of truth had arrived, and my hands were shaking like I was about to defuse a bomb, instead of open what might be the find of a lifetime. With trembling fingers, we pried off the corroded metal bands and lifted the waterlogged lid. The smell of salt, age, and something earthy hit us, like the breath of another century escaping its tomb. The first thing I saw was rust-stained fabric, and what looked like old coins fused together by centuries underwater. Then the morning light hit it just right, and suddenly we were looking at something that belonged in a museum or a pirate movie. Gold doubloons, silver reels, jewelry embedded with emeralds that caught the light like 1,000 tiny green eyes. This wasn't just treasure. This was the real deal, the kind of discovery that makes archaeologists weep with joy and treasure hunters retire to private islands. Anna and I just stared at it, like we were seeing a ghost in the past that had brought light and hope with it from another century. The first few minutes were pure euphoria, like being kids who just discovered the ultimate Halloween candy stash. But then reality crashed the party harder than a rogue wave. What exactly were we supposed to do with a chest full of 18th century Spanish treasure? Walk into Wells Fargo and ask for a doubloon deposit form? Gold isn't just shiny metal. It's responsibility wrapped in legal complications with a side order of bureaucratic nightmares. We knew that getting from, hey, we found treasure, to, hey, we can legally spend this treasure, was going to be more complicated than the hunt itself. In a world where gold talks, you better know how to speak its language, and that language is fluent legalese with a heavy accent of federal regulations. Finding a maritime lawyer, who actually understood treasure law was like trying to find a unicorn who also did taxes. Most attorneys I called either hung up when I mentioned sunken treasure or quoted hourly rates that would have bankrupted me even with a chest full of doubloons. But eventually Anna's academic connections led us to Robert Robertson. And yes, that was actually his name, a maritime law specialist in Tampa Bay who turned out to be an old sea dog in a three-piece suit. Robertson took one look at Atlas's meticulous journal entries, our underwater photographs and the treasure itself, and nodded like he'd been waiting his whole career for exactly this case. The man was like a shark in the ocean of legal proceedings. If sharks wore reading glasses and charged $400 an hour. I'd always thought law was boring back in my insurance days. Turns out, when it's your treasure and your future on the line, legal terminology becomes fascinating real quick. I had to learn about admiralty courts, salvage rights, and something called the law of fines that sounded like it was invented by pirates, but was actually created by very serious judges in very serious courtrooms. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, the former insurance guy who'd spent years assessing other people's risks, now having to navigate a legal system that made my old actuarial tables look like comic books. Sometimes, to survive in a new world, you have to remember how you survived in the old one. My background in documentation and risk assessment turned out to be exactly what we needed. The legal process took almost a year, a full year of paperwork, court appearances, expert testimonies, and enough coffee to float a small boat. During this time, Anna and I became more than expedition partners. We became a team in every sense of the word. Living together on Medea, while the legal wheels turned slowly, gave us a chance to discover that what had started as shared adventure had grown into something deeper. We'd take short sailing trips when the court proceedings got too overwhelming, anchoring in quiet coves where the only law that mattered was the rhythm of the tides. But we always returned to face whatever legal hurdle came next. Anna was brilliant at organizing our documentation, cross-referencing Atlas's research with maritime law precedents, and somehow managing to keep me sane when the bureaucracy threatened to drown us both. Every step was a test of patience and determination, and our relationship, proving our right to the treasure, meant establishing that we'd found it in international waters, that we'd followed proper archaeological protocols, and that Atlas's research gave us legitimate claim to the discovery. The government wanted their cut, of course. The state of Florida wanted their piece. Even Spain tried to make a claim based on the ship's original nationality, which led to 10 months of international legal wrangling that made my old corporate meetings look like casual coffee chats. But Atlas's journal was our secret weapon. Every page was like a legal brief written by someone who'd actually done his homework. His research was so thorough, his documentation so meticulous, that even the most skeptical judge couldn't argue with the evidence. That old sea dog had known exactly what he was doing when he left me that inheritance. The day the judge handed down the final ruling was better than winning the lottery, getting promoted, and realizing your past life finally feels like just that, past. But first, we had to get the treasure professionally appraised and sold through authorized auction houses, a process that was almost as nerve-wracking as the legal proceedings. Watching experts handle each piece, hearing them estimate values that kept climbing higher than we dared to hope, was surreal. The final auction results were staggering. $7 million. Our 80% share meant $5.6 million. After legal fees, taxes, and various governmental fees that seemed designed to fund someone's yacht habit, we walked away with just over $4 million. Caleb Morrison, former insurance adjuster who'd lost everything for refusing to sell a boat, was now officially a millionaire. But here's the weird thing. I didn't feel rich. I felt free, and that was worth more than any number on a bank statement. So, what do you do when you suddenly have more money than you ever dreamed of? Buy a mansion? Upgrade to a mega yacht with a helicopter pad? Trade in your old life for a newer, shinier model? Anna and I had a different idea. We invested a couple $100,000 back into Medea, not to turn her into some floating palace, but to restore her to the magnificent vessel she'd been in Atlas's heyday. Only better. New engine that purrs instead of growls. Navigation equipment that actually knows where we are. Solar panels and water makers that make extended ocean voyages feel less like survival expeditions and more like floating camping trips. The money gave us freedom, not obligations. Freedom to choose where we went and when. Freedom to spend weeks anchored in some perfect cove without worrying about marina fees. Freedom to follow our curiosity instead of our budget. As Seneca once said, freedom is not having many things, but needing very little. We just learned to need very little very comfortably. I'll admit, there was a moment of temptation. We were walking through some upscale shopping district in Fort Lauderdale, and I spotted this watch in a jewelry store window. The kind of timepiece I coveted during my corporate days when status symbols actually meant something to me. I went and tried it on, felt the weight of engineer perfection on my wrist, and felt nothing, absolutely nothing. And for the first time, I realized I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, least of all the version of myself who'd once measured worth by price tags. The real luxury wasn't gold or gadgets. It was watching sunrise over the ocean from my own deck, diving on reefs that most people only see in documentaries, having conversations with Anna that lasted until the stars came out. We discovered that genuine wealth isn't measured in bank statements, but in the number of perfect moments you collect and the depth of experiences that change who you are. Media became our floating university, workshop, home, and gateway to freedom all rolled into one perfectly restored package, where the curriculum was wonder and the tuition was paid in salt, sweat, and silence. We started collaborating with marine museums, documenting our dives, creating an online resource where we shared our research and underwater photography. We helped recover ceramics from a 17th century Dutch trading ship off the coast of Curaçao, tiny plates that hadn't seen sunlight in 300 years. And I swear, Anna treated each one like it was sacred. It was a kind of life I couldn't have imagined in my sterile corporate existence, where the biggest adventure was finding a new route to avoid traffic. We traveled the world, diving not for gold but for knowledge. Every shipwreck had a story. Every artifact we documented added another piece to the puzzle of maritime history. We became citizen scientists, contributing to real research while living the kind of adventure that most people only read about in books they wish they'd written themselves. The treasure Atlas left me wasn't the end of the journey. It was just the beginning. It had given us the resources to keep exploring, keep learning, keep pushing the boundaries of what we thought was possible. We were ready for whatever discoveries waited beyond the horizon. I'd found treasure, found love, found myself. My life had become the adventure story I'd been too scared to write when I was busy living someone else's definition of success. But as often happens when you climb to the top of one mountain, you start noticing other peaks in the distance. And sometimes, shadows from your past begin to appear on those distant slopes, wondering if maybe they'd made a mistake when they decided you weren't worth their time. But not every ghost stays buried forever. Some have a way of drifting back, like tides that refuse to forget. You know how they say success has a way of bringing people out of the woodwork? Well, 3 years after Anne and I had settled into our new life of adventure and discovery, those shadows from my past decided to make their grand reappearance. It started with an article in National Geographic about our archaeological work. They dubbed me the Caribbean King, which honestly made me sound less like a scholar and more like a mascot for a Caribbean buffet. My phone, which had been blissfully quiet for years, suddenly came alive like a slot machine hitting jackpot. The first call was from my father. His voice was so syrupy sweet, I could practically taste the artificial flavor through the speaker. The man who'd hung up on me 3 years earlier was now telling me how they'd always known I was special and how proud the family was of my success. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. Where exactly had this pride been hiding when I was living on ramen noodles and learning to fix diesel engines with YouTube videos? It was like watching a bad actor try and convince you they'd never seen the script before. When my father launched into his rehearsed speech about family forgiveness and fresh starts, I found myself responding with a calmness that would have shocked my younger self. I thanked him for reaching out, acknowledged that success had changed my circumstances, but made it clear that my family was right here on Media with Anna, who'd become my wife during a sunset ceremony on a tiny island in the Bahamas 6 months earlier, with only the ocean and a few curious seagulls in attendance. I told him we'd built something beautiful together. Not just wealth, but a life filled with purpose and discovery. We'd weathered storms both literal and metaphorical, found treasure in places deeper than any ocean, and learned to live without conditions or approval from anyone else. He spoke of legacy. I spoke of letting go. And in that moment, I realized we weren't even speaking the same language anymore. The silence on his end of the line spoke louder than any words could have. They understood, probably for the first time, that they'd lost this particular game, not because I was punishing them, but because I'd simply moved beyond the need for their validation. Then came the call I'd been expecting, but somehow still wasn't prepared for. Abby's voice flowed to the phone like honey mixed with just the right amount of regret. She'd always understood my love for the sea, she claimed, and wasn't such a shame how things had worked out. But maybe, just maybe, we could fix everything now that I'd obviously figured out this whole treasure hunting thing. The woman who'd given me an ultimatum between her and my boat was now suggesting we could work things out. I could almost picture her mentally calculating how my new bank balance might factor into our renewed relationship. It was so predictable it was almost charming, in the same way a broken clock is still right twice a day. Abby's call followed a similar script to my father's, but with more emphasis on how much she'd learned about herself and how ready she was to embrace the adventurous lifestyle she'd obviously always secretly wanted. The same woman who complained about spending weekends at the beach was now claiming she'd always dreamed of sailing the Caribbean. It was like listening to someone try to convince you that black was white and up was down. But here's the thing that surprised me most. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no hurt, no satisfaction at being vindicated. Just a strange, peaceful emptiness where all that emotional baggage used to live. They were like echoes from a life I'd outgrown, voices from a person I used to be but could barely remember. I wished them both well, genuinely, but declined their invitations to reconnect. Not out of spite, but out of simple recognition that we were living in completely different universes now. They saw dollar signs and lifestyle upgrades. I saw freedom and the kind of peace that can't be bought or borrowed or inherited. Anna, who'd been listening to these conversations with raised eyebrows and barely contained amusement, pointed out something I hadn't quite articulated to myself. I wasn't the same person who'd left Boston 3 years earlier. That guy had been desperate for approval, willing to trade his dreams for security, afraid to disappoint people who'd never really known him anyway. This version of me, Captain Caleb, treasure hunter, underwater archaeologist, whatever you wanted to call him, didn't need anyone's permission to be happy. I'd found something more valuable than gold or family acceptance or romantic validation. I'd found myself, and more importantly, I'd learned to like who I'd become. As Viktor Frankl once said, what does not destroy me makes me stronger, and I was living proof of that truth. The people who'd written me off as a failure were now trying to climb aboard a success story they'd had no part in creating. But their validation felt as relevant as last year's weather forecast. Medea had become more than just a boat or even a home. She was a monument to the power of choosing uncertainty over security, adventure over approval, growth over comfort. Every sunrise from her deck was a reminder that the biggest treasures aren't buried under sand and coral. They're buried under years of other people's expectations and her own fear of disappointing them. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd learned to generate my own sense of worth, powered by salt air and shared adventures, and the kind of love that doesn't come with conditions. Anna and I continued our work, diving on wrecks and documenting history, and contributing to the kind of research that mattered to us. We weren't just living well. We were living authentically, which turned out to be the rarest treasure of all. Every day brought new discoveries, not just underwater, but about what it meant to build a life based on curiosity instead of obligation. None of it required anyone else's approval or understanding. We created something that was entirely ours, funded by our own courage and sustained by our shared sense of wonder. Atlas would have been proud, I think, to see his ragged old boat become the foundation for exactly the kind of life he'd always lived. So here I am, 41 years old, sitting on the deck of my Medea with my wife beside me, watching the sun paint the sky in colors that don't have names. The same ocean that once seemed like a curse when my family turned their backs has become the source of everything meaningful in my life. Those people who once dismissed my dreams are probably still checking their phones for stock prices, while I'm checking tide charts for our next adventure. The waves that carry us forward hold more wisdom than any family meeting or corporate boardroom ever did. As Uncle Atlas once wrote in that journal that started this whole journey, the sea never lies. It will always show you who you really are if you have the courage to listen. I listened. I learned. I became who I was meant to be. Atlas knew. Maybe that's why he left me Medea. Not just as a boat, but as a question only I could answer. True freedom isn't about having enough money to do whatever you want. It's waking up without dread. It's not having to ask permission to be yourself. And every morning I wake up grateful for the chance to live another day of this adventure I accidentally stumbled into when I chose a rusty old boat over everyone else's definition of success.